Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Jazakumullah khair to the organizers and to all of the attendees for arranging and for gathering for this conference. As my brother and sister mentioned already, we've been looking to collaborate for a few years now, and this increased culture now of learning online has facilitated this for us. I hope that inshallah one day we can meet in person, but in the meantime this is a great platform. So I'm very happy to be with you all here today to discuss this important topic. And Jazakallah khair to Dr. Dinar for her presentation just now. It was a great way to set up what we're going to talk about for the next while, inshallah. Now, the question that I've been asked to talk about today is, do Muslim women need feminism? And at the same time, I hope that by the end of the session, we will have also answered the question, why do so many Muslim women reject feminism as well? Because it isn't just lots of Muslim women, running out to become feminists, but actually we need to recognize that there are actually sometimes a silent majority, in fact, a silent majority of, Muslim women who do not profess feminism and are not interested in it for certain reasons. And hopefully we'll be able to see why by the end of this talk. Now, a basic definition of feminism that many would profess is the equal rights and opportunities for women and men. And without getting into details just yet on what Western conceptions of equality or equal rights are, or whether that definition is true, this definition may seem to a Western or a Westernized mind or a secularized mind like a fairly innocent and noble ambition. So the question then is, if that is the case, why has feminism for such a long time been so controversial, even in the West, even today? Why is it so controversial if it's just a simple equal rights and opportunities for women and men? Now, I'd like to start by going very briefly on a few points about the Western secular liberal experience of feminism, sort of as a little bit of evidence and also a bit of caution for those who are in Muslim societies who may be enamored or interested in feminism in the first place. Now, what's interesting is that in Western secular liberal states, women's suffrage, or the right to vote, the right for owning property and the right to work, they were all achieved by campaigners who never used the label feminist. So even in secular liberal states such as the UK today, and this poll was done by a feminist organisation called the Fawcett Society, but polls show that only 7% of women in the UK would identify as feminist. Now, this is even though the majority of men and women were found to believe, and they said that they believe in gender equality, yet only 7% of women would actively identify as feminist. Now, this shows that those who do identify as feminist don't actually wield any kind of monopoly on the issue of women's rights or on the liberal idea of equality. And those who identify as feminists are actually just one group amongst many throughout different cultures, different time periods, different places, whose work actually deals with women's rights. Now, interestingly, the UK suffragists or suffragettes, did they ever campaign under the banner of being feminist? Even Mary Wollstonecraft's seminal book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which is became a very important keystone text for women's rights in the UK and America, it didn't need to create or use the label feminist at all. Then there was a woman named Caroline Norton, and in English law, she was responsible for obtaining women's rights relating to child custody, women's right to form contracts, to inherit, and to keep possession of their own earnings. She herself also never identified as a feminist. And in fact, she was famously anti-equality between men and women. And in one letter that she wrote to the Queen, Caroline Norton wrote the following words. She said that the natural position of woman is inferiority to man. She continues, "Amen, I never pretended to the wild and ridiculous doctrine of equality," end quote. And yet today she is anachronistically praised with the label, the first feminist legislator. So even liberals today consciously choose not to use the label. There are some who do, and there are many who don't. And some, those who do not use the label, they say that they find the term feminist or feminism to be an encumbrance. It's a problem, it makes things a lot more difficult. And they say that with its multitude of competing interpretations, different factions, different divisions, they find that it doesn't actually add any ideological clarity to their cause or for their audience. And there are so many different types of feminism under the broad category. There are so many different subcategories of feminism and so many different sub-definitions for it. You could say that there are as many definitions of feminism as there are feminists. And in fact, many feminists actually seem to spend a lot of time attempting to clarify to the public what they think being a feminist means, or arguing, that's not my feminism, when they come across a definition that, they don't necessarily agree with. But if the purpose of identifying as something is to actually set you apart or to demarcate you from a different worldview, in other words, the purpose of language, because the whole purpose of language is to actually identify the limits of where one meaning ends and where the next meaning begins. So what is the benefit of using an unclear label that doesn't have those clear limits of meaning? Shouldn't people actually be called, or shouldn't we be advocating for people to actually just use clearer terms to describe themselves and to describe their beliefs? Surely this would actually make things easier for them and for us. Now, liberal campaigners in the West, they often risk being condemned as wrong if they don't use the label feminist. Especially if they choose instead to campaign under terms that are more publicly recognized, more publicly understood, and more readily embraced in liberal societies. So they may use terms instead of feminism like women's rights activist, or human rights activist, or egalitarians. Again, I'm talking, remember, in a secular liberal society, so I'm referring to their worldview and the concepts that they hold, not the Islamic worldview, which we'll come on to shortly. Now, feminism gives people the latitude, it gives people the permission to come up with their own interpretations of feminism, and they will still embrace it and defend it as feminism. In which case, people should have the exact same freedom and latitude to disagree with these interpretations and to subsequently not identify as feminists. Because there is no single definition, therefore, to actually defend. It just becomes feminism is what feminism does. And also interestingly is that the term feminist doesn't actually seem to advance causes at an institutional level, like in court cases. For example, most human rights lawyers identify professionally as human rights lawyers. Most family law lawyers identify as family law lawyers. They don't identify as feminist lawyers, even if they're defending, the interests of a woman in a particular case. They would still not identify as a feminist lawyer just because they are defending a woman's issues. However, professionally, many lawyers identify as human rights lawyers, family law lawyers, etc., etc. Now, the feminist label, historically and in law, is just not perceived as a label that helps somebody to further their argument, and it doesn't help to cement authority. So, for example, in the history of the US Supreme Court, for example, it is only mentioned twice the word feminism is only mentioned twice in passing, just as a passing reference, only twice in the entire history of the US Supreme Court. Now, if the feminist label doesn't actually help the cause of rights, why do we need to use it? Why would anybody need to use it? Let's not forget, especially in legal systems, those working in the law or for social workers, our work should be in the service of justice, not in the service of the labels, not in service of the label feminist for its own sake. The concern should be justice. Now, in response to this, feminists may argue that the label feminism, it's just about, reminding people and inculcating in people, about the equality of men and women. And it's just about reminding them that if you believe in the equality of men and women, then you're already a feminist. But if that is already the case, if you're already a feminist, then why again do they need to identify as feminist? And if it's just about equality, as they say, then feminists should also argue that people should identify as a meninist or a men's rights activist, because they too claim to define their label as belief in equality of the sexes too. Now, if anybody's not sure what I'm referring to, in the UK and in the United States and other countries around the world, in response to feminism, you now have a backlash from many men who are doing the same thing that feminists do, but for men. So they call them men's rights activists. And there's no real difference between them, apart from which gender they are championing. And they both claim that they're just interested in the equality between men and women. Well, if that's the case, then why are there different factions and why do they need different groups? If they're both eager for equality, then why are they not both working together under the label egalitarianism in the West? Now, if using the term feminism or any other, men's rights activists, whatever it may be, if using the term feminism is just about solidarity, some people might say, it's just about getting support together and making people feel like they have a tribe or a sense of asabiya. If using the term feminism is just about, about solidarity, then maybe it's time, for a new group label to engender that solidarity. For Muslims, as we'll come on to, this label could be, Muslim or Islam. Imagine if the Prophet ﷺ had come and said, you are now one tribe. Funnily enough, he did. So that's the Muslim perspective. We'll come more into that later. The other thing is, times change, people change, and movements change. And yet somehow we have many social justice activists who insist that we become slaves to terms which no longer apply or which do not apply to our circumstances. And so, there are those who would say that, we should slavishly adhere to the term feminism. Whether the meaning changes or not, we should still use the term according to them. Why should we do that for a term that has actually been demonstrated to be of minimal impact to actual change? If it's about garnering support in numbers, if it's about, using a term that will draw more numbers together, again, a social justice movement could easily attract more numbers and evade the criticism of the opposition by using terms like, again, in the West, the term egalitarian. So this is a sort of a very brief overview of the situation in the secular liberal world. So we can see roughly that, social and political movements can and have campaigned successfully without using the label feminist. The second point is that if there's no universal definition as to all the beliefs that make up feminism, apart from, the core tenets, patriarchy, individualism, and, the equality that they claim, which we'll come on to later. But if there's no universal definition that properly sums up all of feminist ideology and belief, and it's a term that often incurs resistance from people because it's perceived as being sectarian, then people should make a rational decision to abstain from using an unclear label. The third point is that there are those who follow different approaches to women's rights. Like Muslims, like us, we follow Islam and we choose to identify as Muslim because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, call yourselves Muslim. There are those who follow Christianity and identify as Christians. There are those who follow Judaism and identify as Jews. women should have the autonomy that feminists want us to have, to choose a name that works good for us, that works better for us, that makes sense for our cause without facing social stigma and the harsh rebuke that often comes when we say, I am not a feminist. So if they claim that women should have the autonomy to choose, then we should have the autonomy to reject feminism and use our own worldview. Now, when it comes to, just to again clarify and cap that was a particular discussion on how feminism should be addressed in a secular liberal environment and the minimal impact that it has had, which is important because when these concepts seek to be imported to the Muslim world, we need to understand its proper place and experience in the Western world, because sometimes it can be glorified or made to seem better than it is, and attempts made to show this off to Muslims in the Muslim world and say, look what a great system this is, you know, look how much it has accomplished. So it's important to recognize, and there's obviously all manners of depth that we can go into on that, but it is important to recognize the place that it actually has. Again, just as a reminder, the amount of women that actually identify as feminists in the UK was surveyed to only be around 7%. That was in 2015 or 16. So, you know, it's minimal, and I would hope that those numbers reflect in the Muslim societies as well. Again, I mentioned earlier about a silent majority of, you know, Muslim women that don't, you know, that are not feminist, and we just don't hear about them because they're not maybe as vocal about it. Now, moving to Muslim society. Muslims are problem solvers. Now, as Muslims, we believe that Islam provides the solutions to all human problems. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us as Muslims to be problem solvers using those solutions. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for example, that even to remove an obstacle from the road constitutes an act of charity because it is a problem solved for others. To lift someone's mood, even simply by smiling, is a charity, even though it may seem like only, you know, a small problem is solved or a small thing is being done. We are commanded to find cures for sickness, to try to alleviate the plights of others. We are given the duty of, and we are rewarded for, solving problems. And we are commanded to fulfill our rights and duties towards each other as well, including the rights and duties between men and women, as prescribed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not as prescribed by humans. And the Quran commands us to be witnesses to mankind, to be witnesses, to call to what is right and to speak against what is wrong. We are meant to be advisors and problem solvers, and that's the service of Muslims to all, regardless of our gender, regardless of our occupation. Now, implementing Islam secures women's rights, not implementing anything else. Implementing Islam secures women's rights for Muslim women. So, for example, as late as there's one very interesting observation of this being the case, and you don't have to go all the way back to, you know, the beginning of Islam or early Islam. You can go to one of the latest periods in time in which you had Islamic governance as a holistic system known as a caliphate. So, for example, as late as the 18th century, one English travel writer visited the Ottoman Caliphate, the Ottoman Khilafah, and she wrote the following about what she saw of Muslim women there. So, you know, contrary to, you know, the reports we hear today of Muslim women, you know, are oppressed or facing this or that, or, you know, they don't have identities, they don't have any kind of freedom whatsoever, any kind of self-awareness even sometimes. This is what she said about what she saw of Muslim women in the Ottoman Caliphate. She said, as to women, as many, if not more than men, are to be seen in the streets, in other words, going about their daily activities. I think I never saw a country where women may enjoy so much liberty and free from all reproach as in Turkey. The Turks, i.e. the Muslims, in their conduct towards our sex are an example to all other nations. And I repeat it, sir, I think no women have so much liberty, safe from apprehension, as the Turkish, i.e. the Muslim. And I think them, in their manner of living, capable of being the happiest creatures breathing. Now, this was in a time where, as I said, Islam was being implemented holistically on, the majority of the Muslim world. Now, in a Muslim society, obviously there are in society today, there are a number of problems throughout the world, not just Muslim society. There are a number of problems, global health pandemic, for starters, global poverty and neocolonialism, neo-slavery, global warming, all these kinds of issues, and also economic issues. And one was the sorry, there's a question there. I'll just her name is, sorry, there's a question very quick for a clarification. The woman who wrote on the women in the Caliphate, her name I will grab for you shortly, inshallah. It's also on my website. There is a full article with all the links. The article is called Ottoman Women During the Advent of Western Feminism. That has this quote, many more quotes, and also all of the names and the resources for that as well. So that will be where you can find those, inshallah, if you want them quicker. Now, in a Muslim society, if there is a lack of implementation of women's rights, and there's differences from country to country, from around the world, as to the status or whether women's rights are being fulfilled or implemented properly or not. There's a difference throughout. It's not just one blanket story overall. But generally in a Muslim society, the lack of implementation of women's rights serves as a glaring piece of evidence that the society overall is not functioning on Islamic principles. And in fact, the lack of rights being fulfilled for any group in society, not just women, but any group in society, is a symptom of a deeper problem that actually pervades all other aspects of a society and often points to the infrastructure of society, the governance of society in the first place. Now, it's not uncommon to hear feminism, therefore, being invoked as a so-called remedy for some of these problems. And a great deal of confusion and misunderstanding is often generated when we imagine that feminism is the only way to visualize and actualize women's rights. And when we imagine that feminism is entirely synonymous with women's rights. And then when we try to amalgamate feminism with a different worldview, such as Islam. Now, seeing how problematic feminism is for secular liberals, as we discussed very briefly earlier, why do some Muslim women still want to champion the label and concept of feminism in Muslim societies? Now, Islam enshrined women's right to property, women's right to work, and even that leaders could be legitimized with the consent of both women as well as men. So, in other words, the equivalent of the Western right to vote. All 1300 years before Western states granted these rights to citizens, before they even conceived that these should be rights in the first place, let alone implementing them. And all of this, again, was achieved without anyone needing to identify as feminist. So how did this happen, without feminism coming to the rescue, or without any other gender-centric solution? Now, feminism is one approach to the matter of women's rights, but it is just one approach. The way I would explain this is that feminism is to women's rights what capitalism or communism are to economics. So if economics is about the distribution of resources, and capitalism and communism each have their own ideologies, their own worldviews on resource distribution, similarly, feminism is one approach to the matter of women's rights, and Islam is another approach to the matter of women's rights. But more than just being one approach, it is very important to remember that feminism is an ideological approach. It is rooted in a secular liberal worldview. And feminists very often use the language, and language is very important. They use the language of secular liberalism by invoking what would seem to be, you know, very noble concepts, you know, very praiseworthy, admirable concepts, such as, and we touched on one earlier already, but such as the concept of equality, or the concept of freedom, or the concept of empowerment. And they use these words, making it superficially attractive. So on the surface, people think, what's wrong with that? These sound like great things. But just as feminism shares the language of liberalism, it also shares its contradictions. Calling for, I don't know if you have a version of this game in Indonesia, but in the UK, I'm sure you have a version of it. But in the UK, we have this game that you play as a kid. It's called rock, paper, scissors. So, you know, rock, paper, scissors, and on three, each person, you know, you have two people playing. One person will do, you know, you pick randomly whichever one you're going to do. And there's certain combinations of one person will necessarily beat the other person because paper wraps rock, rock blunts scissors, and scissors cuts paper. So this is a game that you play. And the idea is that rock, paper, and scissors in a circle, they all cancel each other out. And similarly, calling for equality, freedom, and empowerment is like playing rock, paper, scissors, because each one intrinsically limits the next one. It cancels out the next one. Because if you think about it, with equality, if everyone is equal in the eyes of the law, then empowerment, in other words, giving someone an advantage, actually negates that equality. And equality actually restricts freedom because it forces people to be uniform or the same as one another. And also maintaining individual freedom denies the empowerment that other people have over them. And so they all cancel each other out at some point or other. Now, we also find that these concepts, the liberal conception of equality, the liberal conception of freedom, and the liberal conception of empowerment, they're each based on an erroneous rationale, and these lead to damaging outcomes. So, for example, currently, Western culture and civilization and feminism is based on the dogma of individualism. And so this is one of the tenets, one of the foundations of secularism in a way. So Western culture and civilization and feminism is based on the dogma of individualism. And individualism makes the assumption that humans are merely individuals and they have no purpose except to exist as individuals. So your own needs and wants and desires, they should prevail, and they should be more important to you than anyone else, any religion or any belief. Do you remember the definition that Dr. Dinar presented about secularization, first taking away or reducing your religion from you, and then the control of metaphysical, removing the metaphysical control over your belief and language? Roughly along those lines. This is what individualism does. It says that no belief system or power is greater than yourself, essentially, and that you should be in charge of how you live your life and what your morals are. And they would believe, that feminists would believe, particularly for feminists, this means maximizing the autonomy or the individualism of the feminist female. So not even individualism for everybody, but for feminists in particular, it's about maximizing the autonomy of the feminist female. And any imposition on this individualism, any encroachment, any restriction on that is perceived as coming from patriarchy, or as a result of patriarchy. In other words, unfair male domination over women. And this is because the problem for feminists is seen on the lines of gender. So when an injustice occurs, they wouldn't think that there is a problem with the system overall. They would immediately diagnose it as being a problem of gender, and therefore the culprit must be male. It must be male power, and therefore, i.e. patriarchy. this is obviously unlike Islam, where we don't view it on lines of gender, but actually we view it on lines of an objective moral right or wrong revealed to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by way of Islam. So for secular liberals and feminists, humans are merely individuals with no purpose except to exist as individuals. The reality, however, is that humans, like cells in the human body, aren't merely individuals. We're social creatures. We're defined by society, by culture, by parents, by genetics, by the languages we're taught. No human being can learn language or the skill, the motor skills, the cognitive skills of language without actually being taught by someone else whilst you are still young. So this is how dependent we are on one another, that if as a child we are not taught to speak by our parents or by an adult or somebody that can speak, if you don't learn at that young age, there comes a point in your life where you can never learn to speak. This is a phenomenon known as, being feral, or a feral child is one that hasn't been able to learn those skills. And if they haven't learned it by a certain age, they'll never be able to learn it. This is how dependent we are on each other. We're creatures that have many instinctive needs that can only be fulfilled by other people. And this is why solitary confinement, for example, is considered one of the most inhumane punishments. To imprison somebody alone, to imprison somebody and then to imprison them alone without any human contact from anybody else, known as solitary confinement, is considered one of the most inhumane punishments, because human beings are not designed to be isolated that way. The reality is that humans were created inside the universe. We didn't create the universe. We were created inside the universe, and therefore we are subject to certain natures, to certain genetics that we have. We didn't create our own nature. We did not create our own genetics. Humans are naturally, mostly we are passive recipients. We don't get a say. We received many of these realities. We didn't choose them or define them. And there's not really any escape from these realities. These are the realities that we live with. That's why it's called reality. That's it, the bottom line. And these realities actually are evidence of a higher truth, the metaphysical reality of which we're a part. This is all evidence for that and a reminder for that. So when individualism claims to put the individual above those metaphysical realities, or above all of those realities, that is what individualism claims to call liberation. But actually, it's its biggest delusion. Because what you're doing is you're orphaning, you're disconnecting humans from their higher purpose, and you're making their lives actually vulnerable to oppression by those in society who happen to have more strength. Rather than giving them a higher moral code that they can call other human beings to account to, they are left to the whims of those who already have power in society. Now, one example to explain this, to really cement this idea, and clarify it in your minds, is the idea that our that our concepts and our rights are actually determined by our creator and shouldn't be left to human beings, is the question of who owns your human body. This is one example to explain this point that I've just made. The question of who owns your human body. Now, one of the key messages that is commonly either obviously or discreetly perpetuated to women is that your body is yours. So the idea that many feminists perpetuate is that your body is yours, and so you can dress it or undress it in the way that you like, regardless of the circumstances. And this is used, previously it used to only be touted by fashion designers, maybe 15, 20 years ago, this was mainly fashion design, a commercial territory where it was to get you to buy more interesting clothes or to show your body or be more revealing, because if you're covering it up, then you're not thinking about your, looking fashionable or cool. And so, a while ago, this was mainly something that only fashion designers would make women paranoid about, that your body is yours. So you're under a lot of pressure on how you present it. But these days, it's also increasingly used by Islamophobic politicians who insist that you are oppressed if you cover your body, and also by many feminists. And this is because they are trying to uphold one of the underlying fundamentals of liberal feminism, the idea of ownership over one's body. So for secular liberal feminists, the idea that a woman should practice modesty, or the idea that Muslim women would cover up to be modest, or the idea that society can influence or have any consideration in how much of your body to reveal or hide, for many secular liberal feminists, they would say that this means that your body doesn't belong to you. And specifically, they would argue that men or the patriarchy therefore control your body. So this is a key thing for feminists, right? They don't want the, you to think that your body is under anybody else's control. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's yours. You can do what you want. They have long complained that because of the patriarchal control over the female body, they would argue that women have been regarded as being, and the term is used, enmeshed in her bodily existence. In other words, they argue that women, unlike men, women are perceived as just being bodies. They're not perceived as rational humans that happen to have bodies. They would argue that women are just perceived as being bodies, but they are not perceived as rational creatures. And they call this concept enmeshment or embodiment, if you want to look it up. Now, according to these feminists, they seek to argue, I am not my body, I own my body. They would argue that society or men's ideas do not own your body. But how exactly do any of us, either men or women, own our bodies? If ownership is control, then neither men nor women own their bodies. Did we give birth to ourselves? Did we make ourselves? Did we decide our natural shape and size? The answer to all of these is no. If ownership is maintenance, can we survive without depending on other bodies looking after us when we are older, or for trading with us when we're younger? Are we independent of our environment and the need for social interaction for our continued existence and our mental well-being? Now, Islam recognizes that we do not own our own bodies. Instead, Islam recognizes that because we do not own our own bodies, we do not have complete right to decide what we do with them, either men or women. Instead, both men and women are entrusted with our bodies by the Creator. It is an amana, and our body has rights and duties from us, and we have rights and duties towards each other with how we use our bodies. Now, the reality is that Islam actually liberates us from enslavement, to blind causality, by asking us to submit ourselves to the ultimate cause, to the first cause, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Islam gives a purpose that is higher than selfishness. It is higher than just thinking about your own needs and thinking that you are, a God in your own right. And it actually gives direction to both men and women, and it provides us with a very clear moral yardstick, an objective moral code, an objective truth, as Dr. Dinar mentioned earlier. It gives us also a justification for what is right and what is wrong. It gives us a justification for what is considered justice. And it also doesn't just give us empty platitudes. It doesn't give us, just goals. It doesn't give us, slogans. It doesn't give us just, empty ideas. It actually gives us a very detailed and holistic method to achieve that justice in the best way that suits human nature. And it's not just for one race, not just for one gender, not just for one group in society, but actually for all of society. Now, what about equality? Advocates of equality generally claim that, engendering equality in society, or bringing about more equality in society, will increase the availability of resources and opportunities to members of the community that previously were discriminated or deprived. In other words, they claim that increasing equality will increase individual power or individual autonomy, and therefore perhaps equality of quality of life. So this is what they would argue. Now, I'm mentioning this because it's related to feminism, but also because I was discussing egalitarians in my opening section when I was talking about the situation in the West, because it's important that we don't start using the term egalitarian either. It may make sense or it may be more consistent for a secular liberal to use the term egalitarian, but for Muslims, our concept of equality is completely different, such that we don't use the term equality, we use the term balance, but I'll come to that shortly. Now, we need to understand why equality in of itself is also, an incoherent concept. Now, the first point, and this is admitted by many of its own advocates, so many egalitarians or those who advocate equality, such as Joel Feinberg, Isaiah Berlin, Will Kimblicker, they all argue that equality has no rational basis. And they explain this by saying that no two people, regardless of gender, or they explain it in a different way, this is my way of explaining it, no two people, regardless of gender, are identical in either their physicalities, their capabilities, or their tendencies. So then how can equalizing their resources lead to just treatment of them? How can it lead to justice? So that's the first point. The first point is that, given that no two people are identical, how can equalizing their resources result in justice? The second point is that it leads to absurd consequences in practice. So, for example, given that men have a very short life expectancy, at least here in the UK and other Western countries, men have a much shorter life expectancy than women, or a shorter life expectancy than women. Equality then would mean increasing resources and giving special treatment for men during their lives to make up for the resources that they won't be able to use once they have passed away, because they're going to pass away earlier than women. And so therefore, if we're going to have equal resources, then you need to give men more during their lives, more than women, and then women's resource you have to spread out over a longer lifespan. So again, this results in an absurd consequence. The third problem is that it gives rise to moral inequality in practice. So for example, trying to level the playing field between men and women actually ignores the differences amongst men and women of different social or economic classes. So not all men and women have the same circumstances. So simply trying to equalize men and women doesn't take into account a lot of other differences that are in play. The fourth problem is that equality cannot be applied without contradicting itself. So for example, most governments would be considered to be betraying their own citizens if they gave foreigners the same rights as their own citizens. And yet, all people are considered to be equal, and yet governments need to make a distinction and say their own citizens get a certain amount of treatment and foreigners get a different treatment. So it cannot be applied without contradicting itself. Similarly, all children are equal, all children are beloved, and yet parents are not expected to have the same level of responsibility towards other children as they have towards their own. Again, it can't be applied without contradicting itself. Most significantly, it is actually a misdiagnosis. And it imagines, erroneously, it falsely imagines that inequality of material resources is the reason for injustice in society in the first place. And in fact, even some feminists realized this when they saw that in meritocratic environments, many Scandinavian countries where, it is considered that women and men are more equal in society, economically and politically, they found that women still preferred to work less hours than men and still chose to leave their careers to pursue family life. So therefore, it is a misdiagnosis that it is a difference in resources that leads to men and women having different lives or different life choices. Therefore, it would be misguided to pursue this liberal conception of equality if we want to resolve injustice in our societies. Now, simply speaking, feminism is an ideology that makes the female individual, rather than the male individual, the judge or the arbiter in working out what is good for women. Islam, on the other hand, makes God the arbiter. It makes God the judge, and it makes the individual, or the humans, it makes them the agents of implementing the objective moral code that God has revealed. So whilst individualism differs to the nafs and a person's own changing desires, Islam or Muslims are ordered to interrogate, to challenge the nafs, and instead defer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whilst feminists call for equality, Islam, on the other hand, calls for balance, and we'll come more into this balance very shortly. But it is not feminism that Muslim women need, but the revival of the moral code that the Creator laid out for his creation in very clear, mubin detail. Now, the goal of Islamic feminists in particular, now, as Dr. Dinar pointed out, there are different categories of Muslim women who may use the term feminism or use the label feminism. There are what I would call, as the categories that Dr. Dinar set out quite helpfully. Another way of categorizing it is those that use it in a soft way and those that use it in a hard way. So there are those that use it in a soft way, and I'll talk about those later. But those are the ones who would just use it innocently without fully understanding the ideological repercussions of feminism. But what I want to talk about now is those that use it in a hard way. So these are mostly those Islamic feminist academics who influence opinion through journals, through articles, and through filtering down their ideas into, Muslim society through that means. Now, the goal of so-called Islamic feminists is openly admitted by Islamic feminists themselves, by its own advocates. Let's just call them feminists now that you know what I'm talking about. So the goal of Islamic feminism is openly admitted by its own feminists. It's not about comprehending God's will regarding men and women. It's not about trying to understand what rights and duties God set out about men and women. This is a big danger zone and a big misconception as to why sometimes Muslim women say, what's wrong with the term feminism if I'm just trying to enact or implement the rights that God has set out. Islamic feminists themselves will tell you it is not about that. And it's not about comprehending the moral code provided by God, but it's actually to reinterpret the Quran and the Hadith in light of liberal or feminist values. Now, I have an article which sets out, or an essay which sets out so many examples of this. I'm going to give you a few, but if you want to find it on my website, it's called Do Muslim Women Need a Feminist Theology? And that details a number of evidences and examples of this. But just by way of one example or a couple, Asma Barlas, a famous writer, openly declares that her method of determining whether the Quran's teachings are ethical and egalitarian. So first consider that she's made herself the judge over the Quran, and she's brought in another code, ethicalism and egalitarianism, in other words, from a Western secular liberal worldview, because otherwise where did she get this concept of egalitarianism and ethical values? She's brought in a different moral code, and she's made herself the judge over the Quran, and she says that her method of determining whether the Quran lives up to those ethical and egalitarian values, she says, and those are also very vague concepts, right? Ethical and egalitarian. What does it mean? She says that her goal is to combine the Quran's view of egalitarianism and justice with feminist theories. So she has decided that these vague concepts, ethical and egalitarian, she has decided that these are good yardsticks to import from liberal thought and to measure the Quran with. And she is suggesting that the word of the Creator, the word of God, is on equal footing with the musings of Asma Barlas or any of these other originators of these ethical or egalitarian viewpoints, and that she has a right to combine them. So she's not talking about implementing Islam. She's not talking even about reviving Islam. She's talking about combining the Quran with modern secular liberal values. And she's discussed this in her book, Believing Women. The book is called Believing Women, but you can find the same sort of discussion in many similar authors' works. So, for example, the author Ziba Mir Hosseini, she's edited a book called Men in Charge, has multiple essays in it where you can find many examples like this. Amina Wadood, Aisha Chowdhury, and so on and so forth. Again, you can refer to my article on that on my website, which details these a lot more. So in other words, Islamic feminists, so-called Islamic feminists, are not acting as objective interpreters of Allah's revelation, but as liberal feminist reconcilers. They're trying to reconcile the two. And there is no equivalence. You can't say that somebody that is, trying to earnestly understand the will of God is the same as somebody that's trying to impose their personal choice of liberalism or feminism onto the will of God. You can't combine the two and say, why can't we be Muslim feminists? This is what is happening at academic levels. Now, for Muslims, and also just another point on that, one of the claims that they would make is that ijtihad, or the process of legal reasoning, they would argue, these so-called Islamic feminists would argue, that it shouldn't be left to mujtahids. It shouldn't be left to those people, and they say that they are fallible human beings, and therefore it shouldn't be left to them. And they argue that many non-qualified Islamic feminists have the ability to do legal reasoning on Islam, but it shouldn't be exclusive to the scholars, to the mujtahids. And obviously the response to this is that we recognize that human beings are fallible, and that is why the act of ijtihad should only be done by someone that is fully qualified to do so. It's not left, it's not open source in that sense. You can't open up Wikipedia and start, editing it and changing Islam. That's not how it works. You need to have, even though human beings are fallible, this is why we have very strict conditions and strict qualifications for when that ijtihad can happen. It's not somebody that graduates through a Western university that suddenly gets, the right to become, to do legal reasoning. And so this is the importance of maintaining that distinction between what Islamic feminists are trying to do, which is reinterpret and combine, with actually the work of legitimate scholars in Islam and those who are, giving da'wah and nasiha, calling to Islam, to reviving Islam as it is, not to reforming it. Now, for Muslims, God, not humans, not feminists, not Western secular liberal feminists, not Islamic feminists, not human rights activists trying to formulate the best calibration of rights that people should have, but God, the creator of all, was the one that decided that a woman's deeds would be judged no differently than a man's deeds in terms of good conduct, truthfulness, patience, charity, fasting, repentance, their bidding for what is good and forbidding of what is bad, her use of knowledge. It was God, not humans, that stated in the Quran, I do not waste the deed of any among you, be they male or female. The one of you is as the other. It was God, not humans, that decided that there would be no difference between a man's worship and a woman's worship. And in Islam, a woman is an independent entity like a man and fully accountable human being. Her acceptance of Islam is only out of her own original and independent will. It's not by proxy through her father, her husband, or anybody else. God, not humans, decided that she would have her own legal standing and that she could aspire towards any profession or vocation. And if she chose to raise children, heaven would be under her feet. It was God, not humans, that decided that a woman had the right to be provided for, that nobody could control her wealth, and that if she were to provide for her family, she would get more reward than her husband, and that she would have rights over her husband just as he has rights over her. It was God, not humans, that ordained that women should have the right to respect, affection, and time from her husband. None of these things you'll find in any legal code anywhere else, by the way, or at least not in English law or American law, US law. Islam, God ordained that a woman should have the right to respect, affection, and time from her husband, the right to physical satisfaction by her husband, the right to shelter provided by her husband, the right to food and clothing equal in quality to her husband, the right to physical protection provided by her husband, the right to a dowry. As a result of this, women have often played a fundamental role in the distribution of wealth. During the 18th century, for example, Ottoman women of all classes, not just the rich, but of all classes, established 20 to 30% of all the charitable foundations or trusts, or in Arabic, waqf or awqaf. 20 to 30% of those were established by Ottoman women due to the wealth that they were able to preserve due to Islam's economic rights that they had. This included schools, hospitals, caravansaries, baths, fountains, soup kitchens, hostels, and mosques. They were financed throughout the caliphate by women from their own personal resources, and it was for the benefit of the public. And it was God, not humans, that decided that a woman would be obliged, just as a man was, to seek knowledge, to seek education, to advocate what is good in society, and to discourage what is bad. It was God, not humans, that ordained that vast proportions of Islam would be transmitted to Muslims by women, including Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As a result of this, women have often fulfilled the work of Muslims as intellectuals. For example, the contemporary Sheikh Akram Nadwi, he has documented at least 8,000 Muslim female scholars across global history, and that's in the field of hadith sciences alone. Now, because Islam doesn't make sexist differentiations between male and female intellects, both male and female students are reported to have congregated to learn from these intellects. Sometimes they will even crowd around a female scholar's home just to get a little bit of knowledge from her. There are many notable male scholars that are reported to have taken knowledge from female scholars, including Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Dhahabi, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Imam Abu Hanifa, and even the Caliph Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. And this is just to show how normal it was. It wasn't a special thing. Oh, we have female teachers. This is a great thing to celebrate. It was just considered a normal thing. We have teachers. Some are men and some are women. And yet today we have kind of idolized this concept, as Dr. Dinar said, of quotas. How many are women? How many are men? The numbers do not matter. The quality and the caliber is what matters. And these historical examples are to show that caliber was given prominence more than gender, more than anything else. Gender was not really a question in these things in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted both genders to engage in. In the past cities of, I've been told I have a little reminder as to time, so I'm going to keep an eye on that. I am due to wrap up shortly, so please bear with me. Jazakallah khair. So not only have female scholars played a very prominent and critical role in the early development of Islamic law, but Islamic courts were so renowned for guaranteeing justice for women, that during the Ottoman Khilafah, even women of other religious communities preferred, even like from Christian and Jewish communities and other communities, they preferred to have their matters dealt with in the Islamic courts. Now, whilst God provided rights for women, the rights for any person in Islam are incumbent upon duties being fulfilled by others in other sections of society. So the right, for example, for a Muslim woman to manage her own economic affairs and be provided for depends on the duty that a male relative has to provide for her. However, this becomes a pipe dream in situations of poverty or in situations of, capitalism and tyranny and slavery and, debt slavery and things like this. It becomes far more difficult to have this right fulfilled. The right to obtain legal remedies in the event of marital discord, for example, or any other family law issue, depends on the duty of those in authority to actually manage the people's affairs justly. But this becomes almost impossible if there is the lack of an Islamic authority or courts to hear these complaints. The right to go out and seek knowledge depends on the duty of those who are more learned, to actually convey what they have learned. But again, this becomes hazardous or impossible if the streets are filled with violence or war, or the people are too busy scraping together a living to even have any time to think about enhancing themselves intellectually. There is an interconnectedness in Islam between one person's rights, regardless of their gender, and the duties of an entire community. There is an interconnectedness between the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak, the teachers and the students. And it's important to know, and somebody asked a question earlier about patriarchy, I noticed when Dr. Dinar was speaking, that in Islam, the gender of the person that is given an advantage in any situation is again irrelevant. So the Prophet ﷺ said that each of you is a shepherd and each of you has a flock. I'm paraphrasing, but each of you has a flock that you will be asked about. So everybody in some aspect of life has been given an advantage over another. And that advantage has to be there in order for us to be accountable on the day of judgment. If somebody isn't in charge of a certain job, how are they going to be accountable on the day of judgment? They will simply say, this wasn't my job. So the accountability comes from the advantage that they had. So in other words, the responsibility or the advantage has to be there if that person is going to be held accountable for what they are doing. I have a couple more points, but what I'm going to do is just end with a very short analogy, if that's okay. Now, there is a very beautiful parable, which is not from Islamic tradition, but it demonstrates this balance that Islam promotes of rights and duties between people. And it demonstrates it really well. So there is a wise man's tale, which says that, heaven and hell are identical. So, this man, there's a man and he passes away and he goes up, to be judged whether he's going to heaven or hell. Again, this is not an Islamic parable. This is not from Islamic text. It's just an interesting parable. So this man goes up and he meets an angel and he says to the angel, before you take me to heaven or hell, I'd like to see both of them. And so the angel says, okay, come on, I'll show you, hell first. So the angel takes this man to these doors and they open the doors. And the man looks inside and he sees that they're in hell, that he sees a room. And in this room, there are long tables going all the way up and down, filling the hall, filling the room. And it's a huge, huge hall. So there are tables running up and down, and they're covered in food. So there's beautiful food presented on these tables. Food from every cuisine you could possibly imagine. Fresh, crispy, steaming, mains, desserts, sweet, savory, everything that you could imagine. And he looks again and he's like, is this hell? And the angel says, yes. So the man looks closer and he sees that there are people sitting on either side of the tables, or, sitting next to the food. And, they're all miserable. and they all look depressed. Nobody's talking, nobody's doing anything, nobody's eating. And he sees that these people have really, really long chopsticks. That's all they have to eat the food with. Really, really long chopsticks. So that by the time they get the food on the end of the chopsticks, they can't actually reach around and fit it into their mouths because the chopstick's just too long. So the man is very disturbed by this, and he says, okay, take me away from this place. And so the angel says, okay, I'll show you heaven. So the angel takes him to another room, and it is identical. It is an identical room, long hall, filled with these tables running up and down and people sitting either side of these tables. And again, the tables are covered in these beautiful presentations of food. And in heaven, everybody's laughing and joking and talking and having a good time. And the man looks closely and he sees that in heaven, people also have these really long chopsticks. But he sees that in heaven, the people are picking up the chopsticks, and instead of trying to feed themselves, they're reaching across the table and feeding each other. And this is exactly the way in which we need to start thinking more about, or recognizing that Islam has already set out balance between men and women, between human beings, has balanced our rights and duties in that way, so that if we seek to fulfill our duties to others, our rights will also be fulfilled in turn. Now, I know we're going to the Q&A. I would like to end on one more parable, if okay, and it's a much quicker one, but it is from the Hadith. And so there is a narration, I'm going to paraphrase parts of it, but the Prophet ﷺ explained that the example of the person abiding by Allah's order and restrictions in comparison to those who do not is as if everybody got straws for their seats in a boat. So randomly, some people get to sit on the upper part of the boat and other people get to sit on the lower part of the boat. So in life, you know, you may be on the upper deck in some parts, and in other parts of your life, you may be on the lower deck. So in terms of wealth, strength, intelligence, opportunity, looks, you know, all kinds of things, you may be on the upper deck or the lower deck. Now, in life, randomly, you may be, you know, you are divided up this way. And the parable goes on that those who were on the lower deck of the boat, in other words, inside the boat, underneath, they had to go up to bring water. They had to get water from those on the upper deck. And they felt that that troubled the people on the upper deck. And so they said, those on the lower deck said, let's make a hole in our part of the ship and get water for ourselves. And this will save us from annoying those on the upper deck. So if we get it ourselves, that would be much better. We will save them from, you know, from the trouble of having to give us water. And the hadith goes on that if the people in the upper part let those in the lower part do as they had suggested, if they let them drill that hole, all of the people of the ship would be destroyed. But if they prevented them, both parties would be safe. So I would like to end it there, and I hope that this has given some guidance and help on all levels. I hope from a basic level and also some you know, more advanced levels as well. Obviously with a big group, it's difficult to pitch exactly what level to go at, but I hope that this covers a little bit from the basics to also some of the more advanced things, as to why Muslim women oftentimes and most of the time reject feminism, and why some Muslim women think they need it, but in reality they do not. Jazakumullah khair for listening, and my apologies for going 5 minutes over time, and Jazakumullah khair for your patience.
Okay, thank you very much, Sister Zara. I'm very sorry to end your presentation because we have limited time. Such a wonderful and enormous lecture, and I think it's very, very important to us to understand the broad perspective about this issue. As Sister Zara told before, it gives us a very broad perspective from historical, philosophical, political, and also ethical aspect of the feminism. I think we have to continue to the Q&A session. We have many questions here, so I cannot ask from myself to the speakers. Sister Zara and Bu Dinar, we have very much question here. You can, because we have many questions here, then I'm sure that we cannot answer all of the questions. May you open the question and answer feature in your interface, and please scanning and skimming the most relevant question to you, to your lecture, of course. I will give you a moment for that. And I think you can choose maybe, maybe around 3. Please scanning and skimming the questions that have been typed from the audiences. We have many questions here. Thank you for your participation, audience. We will wait from our speakers to choose the question that they want to ask, because there are many questions here that some questions are relevant, some questions are really not. Okay. If you're ready, Sister Zara and Bu Dinar, I will give time for you.
There's quite a lot of questions here. I'm just trying to pick out a few. Mashallah. First of all, it's great.
Take your time.
It's great to see so many, so many intelligent questions and so much engagement. Alhamdulillah. So that's great. And also, if there's a question that you've asked and you want me to answer and I haven't answered it, please message me on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, and I will do my best to answer it in time. But obviously, with the limited format of this time period, we obviously won't get to all of them, but I'm happy to still answer them afterwards. So please don't be disappointed if I don't get to your questions, subhanAllah. I'm just going to have a very quick skim over them and I'll pick out a few, but if you can just give me a moment to do so, that would be great. I don't know if Dr. Dinar wants to go ahead and answer a couple, but I'll just take a couple of moments just to pick a couple out.
So, Sister Zara, can you open your camera?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm still here, don't worry.
Yeah,
just eagerly scanning the questions. So
maybe we can start from Bu Dinar first, or?
Yes.
Yes. I'm sorry, Zaki, I cannot see the questions, because I use handphone.
Okay.
So can you send to my WhatsApp the question. So Sister Zara probably can start. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's cool. That's good. All right. So somebody asked, I'm going to actually go from the earlier questions and see which ones relate to what I was speaking about more directly, and I'll go through it in that order. That might be easier. So one question, is there any possibility for us to do something that is called Islamization of feminism, just like we have a possibility to doing something called Islamization of science or Islamization of knowledge? No. Basically, that is the short answer. And the reason for that, I hope parts of my talk addressed why that is not an option. Now, the reason you can have, and even something like Islamization of science or Islamization of knowledge, these are not necessarily even things that we need either. In Islam, science is science and knowledge is knowledge. There is no Islam's version of it. We may, for example, see efforts where people shed more light on historically relevant milestones in science or knowledge that was done by Muslims. I don't know if that's what you mean by Islamization of science or Islamization of knowledge. But whilst knowledge and science are empirical things, these are researches based on the material world, these things are not or should not be influenced by ideology. So, a correct science experiment is a correct science experiment, whether it's carried out by a Muslim or a Christian or an atheist. If the experiment itself is done properly, taking into account variables and reported correctly, that is just knowledge about the material world. Because science is just a tool, after all. Science is not Science is not a belief, it is merely a research tool, and anybody can use this research tool. Similarly with knowledge, we would argue, is about, reality, truths about the material or the metaphysical world. We call this knowledge. However, feminism is not an empirical tool. It is actually in of itself an ideology. And so this gives rise to some of the problems that I talked about in my talk, where you cannot marry up. It would be a forced marriage, and which is what we see the result of Islam with feminism. And again, I would ask you to check, because of the time constraints, to please visit my essay, Do Muslims Need a Feminist Islam or a Feminist Hermetics. This essay details all of the problems that arise from this so-called Islamic feminism. And it is not just me saying it, it is actually these Muslim feminists themselves say that Islam and feminism are not compatible. And this is why they argue that, that Islam needs to be adapted or reformed or changed in order to align it to feminism. And this need, somebody else asked a question, I think I saw, why do some Muslim women then feel the need to go to feminism? Now, this is tied in with this question, because those who are doing this project of Islamic feminism, why do they then use the term Islam? Why use the term Muslim if what they are actually calling to are secular values? Why bother using the term Islam? Now, it's for the very same reason that in most of the post-colonial Muslim world, tyrants or corrupt people or people who bring in other values, they use the language of Islam to try to gain currency, to try to gain legitimacy with the ordinary Muslim people. Because they know that the language of Islam is respected, and Islam is the one inviolable thing that Muslims have, they therefore realize that using the term Islam or Muslim and adding it to these non-Islamic concepts or values, they feel that this will somehow help it to circulate in society. And you can see that it is, to some extent, doing this, which is why we are having this discussion today. It is because using the term Muslim and Islam actually gets the support of Muslims without necessarily being aware of the reality of what these projects are actually doing. And this actually brings me on to something else I wanted to mention earlier. This question, I'm glad it was asked. So I mentioned in my talk, Islamic feminists, the hard version. And I mentioned that I would talk about Islamic feminists, the soft version. And this is referring to those who innocently use the term. Now, the reason that some people, again, might describe themselves as feminist is due to the incorrect perception that feminism has a monopoly over women's rights, or the incorrect perception that feminism and women's rights are the same term, it's the same meaning, but just different words. And this is why we discuss this so deeply in my presentation, to show that feminism and women's rights are not synonymous. Feminism is simply one strand or one approach to the issue of women's rights. Now, sometimes, as I said again, people use this term because they think it will get more support in the community. And I hope that realizing that only 7% of women in the UK were surveyed to identify as feminist, and I hope that showing that feminism was not used in many of the key the key achievements in English law in terms of women's rights, and I hope that showing that feminism is such an unpopular term in the West will actually help my Muslim sisters to realize that this term is not helpful. It is actually an ideologically charged, misleading term. And it also leaves the door ajar for other feminist ideals which contradict Islam, such as individualism, a liberal conception of egalitarianism or equality, and other liberal conceptions of ideas that contradict Islam. It leaves the door ajar for those feminist ideals to seep into Islamic thought. It takes something unclear which is feminism, and tries to mix it with something clear, which is Islam. Why would we want to do that? There is no room to do that. It also, by using the term feminist or saying feminist Islam or Islamic feminism, you are, by doing this, the person is inadvertently validating those feminist ideals which contradict Islam, because you can't say, I'm a Muslim feminist except for this feminist value. Then why use the term at all? Just call yourself Muslim. It also implies that Islam is just one, Islam is just one location on the grand spectrum of feminism. Instead of actually demonstrating and portraying that Islam is a perfect moral code all of its own. And the final point on this question is that the language and lens of feminism, the language itself, misogyny, patriarchy, male dominated, all these kinds of, this terminology, which is often used by people that are not social scientists, they're not criminologists, and yet they take it on themselves to diagnose problems as being, misogyny or, any of these other things. The language and lens of feminism can't be used by Muslim women by combining it with Islam, because you're trying to convince Muslim men. If you're trying to convince Muslim men, why would you use a language that alienates them in the first place? If Muslim men are your target audience, then why not call Muslim men to Sharia? Why not call them to Islamic rights? Why not say that when someone is doing an injustice, that this is un-Islamic, rather than saying this is misogynistic? Calling something un-Islamic has a far greater impact to somebody that is Muslim than calling it misogyny and using a lot of language that they already are adverse to. And if they're not preaching to Islam, or if they're not calling to Islam, then what are they calling towards? And this should be like a red flag. If somebody understanding all of these things still wants to use the term, then they need to deeply, deeply question and challenge why they are interested in using that term in the first place. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us to call us Muslims, and that's the description that we should use. He asks us to call to Islam, and that is the world, the worldview and the way of life and the deen that we should be calling to. And there's no better way of doing that than by not joining it with anything else. So I hope that answers a few of the different questions I saw in one go, but I'm going to let Dr. Dinar, maybe if she's had a chance to receive any questions, if she would like to answer, and I'll have a look if there for any others that I could answer next, inshallah.
Okay, thank you, Sister Zara. Yeah, there are so many questions, yeah. So I cannot pick one of them, but I try to answer the one that relevant to my topics, yeah, and probably add some. Sorry, okay, this one. Dear Dr. Dinar, do the Islamic concept mean that you agree with patriarchy and its consequence? You said that there's no result of feminism. Can you explain? Okay, so before it is the proposition. Do you agree to patriarchy? What do you mean by patriarchy? Yeah, in this case, probably your definition of patriarchy and my definition of patriarchy is not the same. For example, do you think Islam is patriarchy religion? Because the Qawam in Islamic religion is men. Because feminism said Islam is patriarchy because men become the Qawam, the leaders. And because the ulama, the scholar or Islamic scholars, there are many men. The inheritance for men is much more than women. So it is patriarchy. So if you call this patriarchy, yeah. So of course, I think we have to be clarified first, yeah, about the definition of patriarchy, because feminism and patriarchy is different. Islam doesn't. The term patriarchy itself is not familiar in Islamic terminology. So if you find any patriarchy word in Islamic teaching, you cannot find it. It is come from other civilization. Yeah. So then this definition or this terminology is applied to religion of Islam. Yeah, and become the method of analysis. Yeah, to, like Sister Jaya said, everything should be analyzed in that framework, the patriarchy culture. So if there's a column in Islam, it's patriarchy religion. It's like that. So we have to clarify first, what do you mean by patriarchy? Because if we not agree, I cannot answer that. Yeah. And you said that there are no result of feminism. That Sister Jada already explained so many things about now feminism in the West is only the solidarity. Yeah, because they don't have any common purposes. They cannot tell us, if you read about the second wave feminism, the Betty Friedan's about the problem that has no name, for example. Yeah, they want to be in public, but they don't feel happy, and they come again to home, and they also feel in crisis. So how can say it, as a Muslim, that feminism has achieved a result? Even if you read my article in thisisgender.com, there were a research that said that the decline of a woman happiness, there decline of woman happiness after feminism. So so what's the achievement of feminism then, if the happiness of women decline, are declining? So that's why I said that there are no result of feminism, because that's indicator. But there are other things. And about, I see much, this is about the sorry, okay. Miss Zara Faris and Dr. Dinar, what's your opinion about polygamy, marital rape, and child marriage? Inshallah, we will have a coffee special. Coffee special is online course. If CGS, from CGS, we will have this issue. We will have coffee special to Roth. So we will see how Islam portrayed or Islamic perspective about this matter. So if I explain this now, of course, there will be consumed so many times. I cannot explain. So probably you can join the class, inshallah, online class after Eid al-Fitr. And many more, Okay, probably about this is the same question that about the possibility of Islamization of feminism. Probably you can read in this gender web about the Islamization of term gender, is a part of Islamization of social science. So there's a problem in social science because the assumption, the philosophical, is come from liberal, so we have we have to the social science has to be if Sister Zara said this is the empirical, but of course Islam has their own epistemology. So this epistemology should be applied to see the contemporary knowledge, human science. If we cannot see the assumption, the philosophy behind that concept, we cannot do any Islamization. Because ulama also take some concept from foreign civilization, but it convert to Islamic worldview. Yeah. So, but it needs expert. It needs mujtahid. Is it Islamic scholars that knows the contemporary knowledge and also have an expert in Islamic teaching. So it's not as simple as that, yeah, to know or to do the Islamization of knowledge. Yeah, probably you can read, yeah, our article in This is Gender. Yeah, inshallah, it explained in that article. And one more question, probably, Sister Zara, yeah. How it is the developing trend? How you deal with the problem? How should we deal with it? Is to use Sister Zara, yeah, about how we deal in Indonesia with feminism. Yeah, I think this, yeah, for me is all, yeah. All question is belongs to you, sis, not me. Okay, maybe you can answer some more, sis.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
I just wanted to build upon the question around patriarchy. Now, the reason that for feminists patriarchy is such a big deal is because for them, in a secular liberal society, the rules are being made up by whoever is in power. So there's no revelation that they can refer to as the higher power. So for them, it becomes very important who is in power. And so they have perceived that because it's mainly has been men, that men are, you know, the problem or the source of all their problems. Now, in Islam, yes, we have patriarchy, but the difference is patriarchy doesn't necessarily mean injustice. And this is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Dr. Dinar explained, has established men as the qawwam, right? The protectors over and the ones who are responsible over women. So there are certain roles in society that only men can perform, and women cannot perform those roles. Now, the difference is that when a man or anybody is in charge or placed in a position of authority in Islam, they're not given permission to do whatever their own mind decides is the right thing to do. They're not given permission to make up the rules. Their job is to make sure that the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what is being implemented. So even if there is a man in charge, he is not the one from his own fallible, or any human being has a fallible mind. He is not from his own fallible mind inventing the rules for society. He's not inventing the laws. The most a human being can do is come up with policy. And policy, all human beings can come up with, male or female in government or society can come up with policies. Policies are just about how to manage or how to go about, the details of the implementation of Allah's law. So in Islam, if men are in charge, we don't care as long as they are fulfilling Allah's command. And this is, then a burden that, is left to men. They have to deal with it, and we have the duty to hold them to account for that. So this is different from, as Dr. Dinar said, it depends on what you mean by patriarchy, because for us, they mean very different things. And for us, as long as the authority is acting with justice, why should we have a problem whether it is male or not? Why does it have to be female? And again, it's important to take into consideration that in Islam, women can occupy nearly every position, every professional position, apart from those of the highest leader, or the Caliph, or the ultimate leader. That is a position that women cannot occupy. And again, that is because of the reason is that women are exempt from that role. That burden is put on men. However, as women, we still have a duty to account them for that. So there is a difference between patriarchy in a secular society and a patriarchy in Islam. And in Islam, as long as they're acting justly, it is no problem. with regards to a very, very quick response on polygamy. You know, some people or feminists like to bring up polygamy and say, oh, this is an injustice. And I'm sure Dr. Dinar will go into this in a lot more depth in your course, inshallah. But just very briefly, you know, I'm sure a lot of, you know, feminists, and they say that polygamy is a sign that Muslim women are oppressed. You know, they have to, you know, their husbands, you know, they have to be married to men who are going to marry other women. And, you know, therefore it's unequal, it's unfair. Now, the reality is that it's all consenting adults. So what problem would they have with that? You know, it's if they're all consenting to it, and this is what Allah has revealed, then why should feminists have a problem with that? Especially given that in Islam, at least human sexuality is managed and put at a civilized level by regulating the amount of relationships that someone can have. And if they have a relationship, that they have strict conditions and responsibilities towards that person. You know, this is unlike in, you know, in secular liberal societies where both, you know, males and females, you know, they can cheat on their partners, they can have, you know, temporary partners, they can have multiple partners with no responsibilities and no accountability for that. It is literally people left to their own devices. In Islam, however, you know, at least that thing is regulated and it's limited, you know, to 4. You can only, you know, you can only have relationships inside the institute of marriage, and a marriage has to be properly conducted. It has to be, you know, the consent of both the husband and wife. And the reason for, you know, why can one man have 4 wives, but one woman can't have 4 husbands. And the reason is down to the biological differences between men and women. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordained this. And this is because if a woman has four husbands and marriage is for reproduction, then you can't guarantee that each man will get the fair share of time for reproduction, the fair share of offspring. Because if one man is more fertile than another man, then it means it's unfair, and it means he's in a marriage where he's not actually able to, or, you know, he's not actually able to reproduce fairly because there's also another man in the picture. Another sub issue to that is that men are meant to be responsible for their wives, but if one wife has 4 husbands, there will clash on who possesses responsibility, and you know conflicting orders, you know, from multiple husbands, and so there are a number of reasons why that is the case. And so the key thing to remember with polygamy is for those who bring it up, who come from a secular liberal background, they often bring it up as a criticism that, you know, this is uncivilized and this is unfair. But you should always start the discussion by pointing out the situation in secular liberal societies, which is that relationships here, it's like an open harem, you know, it's free for all. If you have an agreement with someone and you're not married to them, if you're basing your agreement on goodwill, just on voluntary agreements, voluntary arrangements that this person is going to be nice to you or be kind to you, but without the security of, you know, of marital rights. And this is what gives rise to a lot of problems in the West. So that's just a very brief thing on polygamy. It's consulting adults within, you know, the law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed. There should be no problem with that. And, you know, I think there was a discussion I had with one sister from Malaysia who was pro-feminist. And, you know, she was saying that polygamy should be restricted because, you know, many men are taking advantage of it in Malaysia. And, you know, the simple thing to point out is that, you know, if a man has married according to the Sharia to more than one woman, those women have rights in Islam. You can't cancel the second wife and take away her rights based on the first wife. And the children of those marriages, they have rights from their father. You can't cancel those rights just because you don't like polygamy. You know, Islam is so beautifully balanced and established and set up in this way that there is really no room to criticize it. And we just need to work harder to make sure that we understand the hikmah behind these things so that we can defend it when we are asked these things. And the only way to do that is through understanding and studying more and more. So that's just very briefly on the polygamy question. So that was patriarchy, which is you know, our concern is that Allah's law is being carried out. And so it doesn't matter who is doing that. So patriarchy, no patriarchy, whatever you want to call it, the men are the ones who are responsible, and we have responsibilities to hold them to account. I'm just going to go back to the questions, but I don't know if we want to continue questions or have I missed one. Well, also, if it's possible to save the entire list of questions, I don't know if that would be possible. That way afterwards, I can maybe answer a few more. Or, as I said, if somebody wants their question is a burning question, please do message me on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, and I will do my best to answer you in time, inshallah.